Hi, this is Paul from Paul's Passing Thoughts. Thanks for stopping by for the second part of this video. And we're going to now begin to get into the meat of this sermon and address it point by point. So, on to the next clip and the first sound bite of the sermon that was discussed in part 1.
Kind of go with things that we're comfortable with. Now, that's okay when you're dealing with the mariachi chicken, I guess, at Los Mariachis. But in a time of transition, it really gives us a chance to kind of think about what are the standards that we're going to use to choose a pastor, okay, or anything else. And a couple weeks ago, we were kind of given the results of a survey that we took to kind of see what we were looking for in a pastor. And I don't know, it's always good to kind of quantify, I guess, what the attitude of the group is. And it's good to see whether your intuitions of things kind of match everybody else's. But I don't know that there was anything particularly really surprising here. When I looked at this, I thought, this is what I thought we would pretty much pick. Right? It was good to have that quantified for me. But it kind of begs the question, if that's what we are saying that we want, is it maybe something that we're comfortable with? And if we're comfortable with that, may it also cause us to sometimes miss certain other things that we should be looking for? And so what I want to kind of do today is kind of look at what are God's standards for how we should be making decisions of any type, whether it's a pastor or anything else. And I kind of use the pastor issue just as kind of an example. If you think about what a pastor is for a congregation, okay? Oftentimes a pastor is our representative, right? He kind of embodies what we think we should be as believers, right? So on our list, we wanted someone who preaches well, and we wanted someone who kind of has been to seminary and kind of discern the word, and we wanted somebody who is married because we think that's a good thing, or most of us thought that was a pretty good thing. And so the pastor sort of becomes the embodiment of who we think he should be. He kind of embodies our values. Okay? So pastors are representatives. Okay? But pastors are also shepherds. It's another kind of way of looking at this. And when we think about a pastor as a shepherd, he's to be who Christ wants him to be. And he's to kind of help mold us into who Christ wants us to be. And so when we need chastening, the pastor needs to chasten us. And when we need encouraging, he needs to encourage us. And hopefully those two things are the same. Our values, pastor as our representative, God's values, pastor is our shepherd. Okay? And if those things are together, that's great. And I'm not suggesting to us that, in our case, that those are necessarily far apart. Okay? But they can have a tendency, because our values versus God values, they can have a tendency to separate. And I think many a person has been pushed from the ministry because they could not be all things to all people, because they had to try to embrace everyone's different image of who they were supposed to be. So as we kind of get into this time, we're in this time of transition, I think it's a good time for us to kind of examine, how do we go about making decisions? And so that's what I'd like to do here today, because if you don't, the result can be a lot of division and a lot of quarreling and a lot of fighting, and churches end up splitting over issues like this. And I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen to us at all, but I think it's a good time for us to kind of step back and look at the whole issue.
Okay, in this first clip, we begin to see problems. He notes that we tend to choose what makes us comfortable. That's true. But it's kind of presented as an inescapable reality rather than mentioning what Scripture says about making decisions specifically that we're comfortable with contrary to God's instruction. Again, he reiterates the fact that the sermon is about making wise decisions and how to do that. He speaks of that in regard to making wise decisions in general. In this specific case, choosing a new pastor. He slips in the concept of the pastor as shepherd and mentions that the pastor sometimes needs to chasten the flock. And then he reiterates the importance of wise decision making to prevent division. Now, let me back up a little bit about this whole concept about pastors chastening. All right. As I've written before, pastors don't chasten, and the church does not execute, or the elders do not execute church discipline. That is wholly unbiblical. The church changes its fellowship status with certain members for particular reasons, primarily gross, unrepentant immorality. But at any rate, the church doesn't do the discipline. The church changes its fellowship status with that person, and it is the Lord who does the chastening. And we see this in 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about those who are sickly and sleep because of their abuse of the Lord's table. Also, the Lord's chastening is spoken of specifically in Hebrews 12. But nowhere in the Scriptures does it speak of the elders or pastors doing the chastening, all right, or the discipline, if you will. Now, other than the Lord doing the discipline, the Scriptures do speak specifically of self-discipline in 1 Corinthians 11:31 and 32, and in that there is a marvelous promise that if we discipline ourselves, it'll prevent the discipline of the Lord. Now, there is only one place in Scriptures where it talks about the church executing the discipline, and that is in regard to elders who sin. Elders who sin are to be rebuked before the whole congregation so that the other elders will fear. All right? And just let me slip in that in regard to the horrendous spiritual abuse problems that we have in the church today, that could be greatly hindered if nationally known leaders would publicly rebuke those elders who abuse the sheep, regardless of how often they play golf with them or eat at Applebee's with them. At any rate, I just wanted to make that point. Elders don't execute church discipline. The only time that the church executes church discipline is in regard to sinning elders. Also, I looked at some of the recent messages that he mentioned that have taken place at that church. Actually, I didn't think I put that particular clip of him mentioning that. But this is interesting. He is going to implement a whole nother system here of supposedly biblical wisdom in decision making. Okay? When the Scriptures in two different places, I believe it's either 1 or 2 Timothy, and again in Titus, where the scriptures specifically cite the criteria for choosing a pastor. And as far as division and whatnot, you preach that criteria to the people. Everybody listens to you, looks in their Bibles. Everybody agrees that, yes, this is God's Word and God's wisdom on how to choose the pastor. End of discussion, right? But as far as I can tell in my research, none of these specific passages have been preached in this church during this time of looking for a pastor. Instead, these other principles of using supposed wisdom to choose a new pastor is implemented instead.
Thank you.
So we're going to deal with this issue of wisdom here today. And normally when we think about wisdom, where do we normally start? Book of Proverbs, don't we? All right, so turn to Proverbs chapter 9, because that's usually where people want to go when we think about wisdom. And Proverbs is a good place, because in Proverbs there's the contrast between Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And as the first several chapters of Proverbs go, the writer keeps kind of contrasting these two views for us. But note, we have this kind of encapsulating statement in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, and many of you can quote it, or at least you can quote the first part of the verse. Right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge, and I lost it, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Right? So when we think about this idea of wisdom, wisdom starts with what? It starts with reverence. It starts with awe. It's the fear of the Lord. Now, if you think, and then look what the writer says here. And knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. In essence, knowledge is preceded by what? Wisdom. Normally, when and this is kind of counterintuitive for most of us. Most of us, when we think about wisdom, wisdom is knowledgeable people taking what they know and applying it well. But know what the author of Proverbs is telling us. That wisdom is really precedes knowledge. Because if you have wisdom, if you have the fear of the Lord, it is going to guide even what you think is worth knowing. It guides the process of what you choose to learn. Okay? If I think that learning to be a triathlete is a good thing, it's going to drive my understanding. It's going to maybe drive me to looking at certain types of magazines and certain television shows and things like that. So my standard of what is good precedes even my understanding of what is good knowledge. And that really is kind of counterintuitive to us, because most of the time we think that wisdom is knowledge applied. Well, I really want to suggest that what wisdom really is knowledge well applied. Well, what does that mean? It means that whenever we approach this idea of wisdom, wisdom must have a target. Wisdom must have a goal. When you're choosing to learn something so that you can progress toward a certain goal or vision of that which is good. So we send people to school, for example, to become more knowledgeable. But what we choose to teach them, or we could teach them anything, okay? But we choose to teach them certain subjects. Why do we teach them those subjects? Because we think that those are the types of subjects that will allow them to get along well in the world. So we have a vision of what is good that drives what we even choose to learn or teach people. So when we think about this idea of wisdom, we have to start with this idea of wisdom as a vision of the good. Okay? And not simply that wisdom comes out of knowing something. Okay? In fact, if you think about it, we know lots of intelligent people, very bright people, who don't start with this fear or knowledge of the Lord. And what do they do with their intelligence and knowledge? they oftentimes will use it as a tool to sort of continue in their unbelief. They defend their bad ideas or their irreverent ideas or their idea that God doesn't exist, okay, by using their intelligence or knowledge. They have a vision that starts and it guides how they look at knowledge and information. So when we begin to think about this idea of wisdom, we first have to start with a fear, reverence, awe of God. Now, the passage in James, it's kind of interesting.
Okay, instead of wisdom and knowledge being pretty much the same thing, he inserts this whole other concept in here regarding wisdom and knowledge being separate, wisdom preceding knowledge wisdom must have a goal, wisdom is a vision. So this whole other concept is interjected of wisdom not being a kissing cousin or for all practical purposes synonymous with knowledge, or even a type of knowledge. It's presented as a vision, and specifically, wisdom is a vision of the good. All right? So instead of having wisdom and knowledge obtained and understood, and then a decision made on it, which leads to an action, which incites us to act, one must ask, if wisdom is the vision of the good, do we need to even make a decision based on the knowledge, right? What is the criteria, I ask, for the vision of the good? And can it be questioned? Okay, so if wisdom is not a type of knowledge, and wisdom always precedes knowledge, and wisdom is a vision of the good, again, I want to reiterate, it begs the question, do we then question the knowledge, since it's preceded by being focused or a vision of, the sea or conglomerate of the good? And then it begs the question also, who is the judge of whether you're swimming in the right pond that is the vision of the good? Well, in Plato's world and in Plato's politics part of his philosophy, the philosopher kings decided what was the good, specifically, the beautiful and the true. In the politics of Plato's philosophy, there were three groups of people that made up society: the philosopher king, the soldier, and the producer, okay, or the average citizen. And it's the philosopher kings that decides whether the knowledge being implemented or applied is the vision of the good or not. And in many Reformed circles, the application of Plato's philosophy that we see is clearly that the elder is the philosopher king, church discipline is the soldier, and the producers are the congregation. And as we look forward or listen to this message further, we'll be looking for those elements.